Hi there, welcome back to my channel, Ben's Autism, ADHD and the Joy Tangents channel. Today we'll be investigating, in a hopefully partially impish but partially incisive manner, how, in my trusty dictionary of Marx's thought book, there is a moment during the entry for aesthetics, which runs thusly. A humanist aesthetics has been constructed from Marx's comments on the nature of art as creative labour, no different in quality from other non-alienated labour. Well, in the Cambridge Companion to Hemingway, reference is made to how Ernest Hemingway's fiction helped his journalism and his journalism helped his fiction. The nearly exact same generation active scribbler Leon Trotsky, during his necessarily epic The History of the Russian Revolution, says, all the muses, even the plebeian muse of journalism, in spite of her sturdy hips, have hard sledding in the times of revolution. And long-time centre-left fellow traveller journalist figure Zoe Williams wrote a Guardian article on Friday, 10th October 2025, which was entitled, Is being a Guardian reporter as exciting as the movies make out? There is a mildly cult online, ambitiously journalistic article called Holidays and Movies and Sartre's Imagination. One of his paragraphs runs as follows. In the early 1930s, Jean-Paul Sartre exclaimed that philosophy would get nowhere until it stopped treating images as isolated postcards stored away somewhere inside the brain and occasionally brought out for view. His first phenomenological phrase, as we know, aimed to restore to mental life an adequate description of images and of the imagination in all their complexity. Marxist sociologists have long argued that in the genuine socialist society of the near future, leisure will more and more seem to feel like work, and work will more and more seem to feel like leisure. Hence, we are back where we started, with the phrase from the Dictionary of Marxist Thought. A humanist aesthetics has been constructed from Marx's comments on the nature of art as creative labour, no different in quality from other non-alienating labour. But then again, A.H. Halsey, author of A History of Sociology in Britain, once wrote another book called Origins and Destinations, which is not the same as saying, by the way, as rampant revisionist Edward Bernstein once opined, the movement is everything, the final goal is nothing. However, as I've said previously on this YouTube channel, although I'm not 100% anarchist, nevertheless, however cardinally important the end goal of genuine socialism is, nevertheless, I'm with Emma Goldman insofar as when she said, if I can't dance to it, it's not my revolution. She was rather hitting the proverbial nail so hard it rang out with top of the range, popular resoundingness. At any rate, the same Dictionary of Marx's thought entry on aesthetics goes on to say, when Marx talks, Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 5, Section 1, about the essential human character of labour, comparing the architect and the bee, it is significant that the architect is invoked merely as an example of a human worker, and not as a privileged category of artist. The notion that all non-alienated labour is creative, and hence intrinsically the same as artistic labour, provides the basis for a humanist aesthetics, which successfully demystifies art by encouraging us to look at its historical development and separation from other activities. Firstly, I don't know about the particular type of discerning disposition possessed by all, if indeed any, of the viewers of this video, but architects can be debatably classed in that Marxist class location category, the labour aristocracy. Secondly, in comparing the architect from the human species with the bee from the animal kingdom, Marx is essentially preempting the 20th century derived sociological formulation of the meso level of sociological analysis and real world action. That is to say, neither solely micro nor solely macro in character, but some sort of simultaneously manifesting multidimensional synthesis of the two. And indeed, obviously, but importantly, this has severe, but not necessarily malign implications for that theme of the New Left Review article from the July-August 2025 number of that radical journal, namely Aaron Bananov's Beyond Capitalism to Institutions for a Multi-Criterial Economy. Moreover, George Orwell, very much a member of the aforesaid Labour aristocracy, insofar as he was a widely published and praised writer who once almost reflexively acknowledged his own class-related privilege when he said, on the one hand, it is only because miners sweat their guts out that superior persons can remain superior. You and I and the editor of the Times literary supplement, and so on. And on the other hand, during his essay Why I Write, Orwell also obviously but importantly said, what I have most wanted to do throughout the past 10 years is to make political writing into an art. Yeah. Hopefully my writing and, in a sense, acting will have at least a fraction, however comparatively minuscule, of the left-wing documentary skill of, say, Vincent van Gogh's painting The Potato Eaters, rather than, say, the turbo-existential angst of Edvard Munch's painting The Scream. Indeed, another article from that same edition, that same fairly indispensable political publication, New Left Review, by the also divine Julie Hertag, is entitled Three Generations of German Working Class Cinema, and is seemingly based, from a long-term perspective at least, out of the same early 20th century art movement of expressionism, which Mr. Munch's The Scream is debatably the most veritably byword archival example of. Therefore, synthesized thusly, the less existentially confessional, more documentary realist The Potato Eaters by Van Gogh seems to be a sort of sophisticated realist aesthetic achievement, pipe dream, to a partially low-functioning neurodiverse person like me. And yet, Oscar Wilde once said that most secretly, generally speaking, Van Gogh aesthetics related to things. We are all in the gutter, but some of us looking at the stars. Well, if that is the case, which vis-a-vis that often overlooked human organ, my heart, tells me is decidedly the case, then it is also another example of what Max Weber called a polar concept, insofar as, when we consider Van Gogh's almost generally speaking down and out matters preoccupied painting, The Potato Eaters, alongside, say, very much the privileged artist Pierre Renoir's painting La Logue, then it suddenly appears possible, after all, for the working class, the only truly revolutionary class, to defy the odds and secure both food-based nutrition, what Gramsci would probably call common sense, and so-called high cultural nutrition, what Gramsci would probably call class sense. At any rate, the Dictionary of Marxist Thought entry goes on to say, a corollary of this view is the recognition that under capitalism, art, like other forms of labour, increasingly becomes alienated labour, art itself becomes a commodity, and the relations of artistic production reduce the position of the artist to one of an exploited labourer producing surplus value. Firstly, the old Guardian Saturday Review, sadly now defunct, back in 2009, lamented how modern students no longer read George Eliot's classic novel, Middlemarch, as a sort of implicitly obligatory rite of passage type of readerly act. There are, it seems, so many other distractions in our culture that sometimes preclude the sustainable, fertile psychological grounds upon which that most lonely, deep focus requiring activity, the reading of literature, requires. Moreover, many aspects of this culture, which 16 years after the article was published has grown even more intense in character, are visual. And yet the London Review of Books, during their archive from the year 1980, referred to both the aesthetically tantalizing concept of color saturation and the no less aesthetically tantalizing concept of the science of color. In other words, although it has been true throughout human history, especially in our culture in late 2025, certain images can become 24/7 utilizable catalysts for deepening and rendering more profound one's relationship with words. Thus, as long as one sees art as being, in many senses, a sacred human endeavor, priceless, in other words, to phrase it in admittedly non orthodox Marxist vocabulary, then Walter Benjamin's great fear that in the age of mechanical reproduction, art predominantly tends to lose its aura needn't, thankfully, indeed pricelessly, apply. Indeed, sometimes not only will the particular important general characteristics of an aura in our age, or in the age of the mature internet, not lose its aesthetic, effective sacredness, but it may become a sort of benign example of each individual instance of a benign commodity fetishism. Benign commodity fetishism. Of course, whenever people start to fetishize commodities like designer handbags and designer trainers and so on, then of course certain moral philosophy related alarm bells really ought to start ringing. However, if people in the age of the mature internet start to fetishize, say, novels, then, well, when you take some time to really contemplate the matter, is this really such a bad thing? And yet, like me, ex Leeds University, I'll spoil your party with my punky sneer. Experts, Gang of Four, sing during their album Entertainment. It makes me want to run out shaking. This said, those Swedish socialists refused, also cerebrally impulsively locatable on the periphery of punk music. See my previous YouTube video, Autism, ADHD, and the Joy of Tangents, published on Monday the 6th of October 2025. Thanks. As they refuse sing during the H.G. Wells hat-tipping album The Shape of Punk to Come. What frequency are you getting? Is it noise or sweet, sweet music? Indeed, G.K. Chesterton, during the underrated work The Victorian Age in Literature, speaks of the James Joyce influencing Henrik Ibsen. When he was young, he wrote solemn plays about Vikings. It was only when he grew old that he started to smash windows and throw fireworks. Additionally, indeed, Sheffield's very own punk periphery genre grafters, Pulp, during their song Help the Aged, say, Help the aged, one time they were just like you, drinking, smoking cigs, and sniffing glue. And yet, despite the palpable existence of all these profound consolations vis-a-vis the passing of time, sometimes, as James Joyce once said, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake, still appears devastatingly to diagnose one species of existence, so to speak, if you are an aspiring writer. Sometimes, then, James Joyce's feeling of being oppressed by the generally palpable in the then societal atmosphere, exploitation and alienation of the already blatantly bipolar tendencies exasperating general literary craft, still applies in late 2025. Indeed, left-leaning comedian Mark Steele, in his book Reason to be Cheerful, says of that dramatic pre-digital era sight, namely of watching the dour bourgeois snooker player Stephen Hendry versus the charismatic working-class hero snooker player Jimmy White, that on several world championship final occasions was such a feature of televised snooker in Britain during the 1980s, you'd think the ruling class would at least let us have the snooker. And yet, perhaps, sometimes they, metaphorically speaking, do indeed concede even such a consolation prize type of social phenomena to our class. For there have been many writers during the history of literature who have written some debatably very readable potboilers, i.e., to expand further on the aforesaid analytical idea ripped from the dictionary of Marxist thought, namely, art becomes a commodity. and the relations of artistic production reduced the position of the artist to one of an exploited labourer producing surplus value. Yes, there have been some very readable pot boilers over the years, from some of Balzac's work to some of Zola's work and beyond into our own century. The Guardian Saturday Review, who, like G.K. Chesterton, were renowned for the breadth of their sympathies, tended to think it in similarly benign, tender-hearted terms, or, as Jack Kerouac commentated on the experience of the practice of composing his paradoxically more experimental novel, Visions of Cody, my heart doth grow. All of this, and more, being the case, perhaps, because of and despite Marx's stark analytical warnings here, we can, over the fullness of time, subjectively come collectively, reclaim pot boilers for the proletariat. As far as this video script is concerned, however, well, to utilise two titles of two book titles by fellow Catholic renegade Graham Greene, in an attempt to fashion them into a cohesive analytical argument, yeah, good luck with that, mate, I hear you cry. I can hope to get to the heart of the matter before it's the end of the affair. And yet, further on into the Dictionary of Marxist Thought article on aesthetics, it is said, as Marx says, Theories of Surplus Value, Part 1, Appendix on Productive and Unproductive Labour. Capitalist production is hostile to certain branches of spiritual production, for example, art and poetry. He goes on to clarify the transformation of our artistic labour under capitalism. I was watching Freeview TV a few months ago, or Granny TV as I call it, and the comedian Joe Lycett was on. And he's at a bar somewhere in the Mediterranean. And he suddenly, without any seeming explanatory provocation, says, "A drink's menu as dense as Ulysses." What the fuck? Say something like, "Ulysses is an acquired taste," or something. Fair enough. But to brutally disparage debatably the greatest novel of the 20th century, live on a television program which millions of impressionable, already fairly screen distracted people are watching, it's cultural vandalism, man. And indeed, so bad is it that, frankly, my attempts to disparage his disparagement, or again, as my late mum Sarah Ward once said in a poetry collection, consider only this, analysis eating itself, seems to be an unsustainable form of parody. But, of course, it isn't, in fact, anything of the sort. On the contrary, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. The soul's a smithy, surely, for everyone alive, just as much as the world's a stage for the same multidimensional multitude. But, as if this wasn't enough, well, I was on holiday in Cornwall recently, a special retreat run for autistic people by a Cornwall-based social enterprise called Wilder Me. A social enterprise being, for those not in the know, the term officially used to designate a firm, company, or business that does not have as its functional raison d'etre, so to speak, the goal of turning a profit, no matter how quantitatively and qualitatively slender that kind of profit is in the contrastingly multifaceted context of the circa 5 million small businesses that currently exist, expand, and sometimes evaporate. What the fuck? In Britain as of today, late 2025. Anyway, at any rate, we were in Cornwall, and the so-called Oxford pleasantries were still reverberating on around the vicinity of everyone's ears. And then one of the special holiday support workers introduced herself. She was, to my mind, rather exotically named India, although originally from the rather British bourgeois quotidian county of Surrey. At any rate, I overheard that she had recently published a book. Naturally, I was impressed and also not a little intrigued. So I did as those proletarian sages the Beatles once urged, and attempted at least to act naturally. And so I blurted out, "Hey, India, Have you read Ulysses? And bang! What she said struck me with the force of a thunderbolt, but sadly, in a negative rather than a positive version of such a Prometheus is the foremost saint and martyr in the philosopher's calendar, kind of seemingly suddenly entire universe conspiring act. For she said, I think we might have studied it at school. What the fuck? I mean, it's almost as if she'd seen the Joe Lycett needless live on TV Ulysses put down. Also, somehow known that I'd recently taken inwardly undulating umbrage at it, and then, bang, attempted to outdo what Mr. Lycett had achieved in the sphere of influential mass television, in the supposedly cast iron guaranteed safe space sphere of autistic retreat, microaggression festooned company speciality land. um, However, seemingly depressing downward moral spirals are not some categorically new invention of the current zeitgeist without any historical precedent. Take the road from Augustean satire of the mid 18th century to the tawdry glamour of the Regency period in British history written about by William Makepeace Thackeray in his novel Vanity Fair in the middle of that century, for example. Or, to refer to a transformation slightly more telescoped in form, that is to say, within the temporal space between two moments within the same century, the 20th century. Well, much has been written about how some of the hippies of the 1960s turned into the yuppies of the 1980s. Indeed, in an article from 1980, the London Review of Books argues that the Trollopian cabinet of Margaret Thatcher's first term grew out of social democratic soil. In other words, the Trollopian cabinet of Margaret Thatcher forgot all about any potentially positively portentous first wave of compassionate conservatism when they would casually, cruelly say things like, oh, homeless people, they are the people you step over to get to the opera. What the fuck? This is the sort of thinking, comrades, which leads to equally erroneous Tory formulations such as the problem with council housing is that it produces Labour voters. Well, I live in a partially council funded and owned house in Sheffield, and you know what? I'm pretty sure I'm going to vote for two former Labour politicians, Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn, at the next general election. And yet, it is also worth flagging up the potential danger of succumbing to the temptation to subscribe to another needless, false dichotomy. Namely, our slogan for this great movement of ours should not only be let's intensely increase the building of quality council houses, but also let's intensely increase the building of quality opera houses. Or, as Michael Jackson once said over in MTV land, the 1980s best version of the 2020s social phenomena YouTube land, don't stop till you get enough. And yet, there is a sinister policy at the residential home for autistic people where I live in Sheffield relating to grocery food rather than brain food, so to speak, called, wait for it, portion control. A subject which I'll expand on a little later on in the proceedings here. For further on into the Dictionary of Marxist Thought article on aesthetics, it is said, to reiterate, Marx goes on to clarify the transformation of artist labour under capitalism. Milton, who did The Paradise Lost for £5, was an unproductive labourer. On the other hand, the writer who turns out stuff for his publisher in factory style is a productive labourer. The literary proletarian of Leipzig who fabricates books under the direction of his publisher is a productive labourer. For his product is from the outset subsumed under capital and comes into being only for the purpose of increasing that capital. A singer who sells her song for her own account is an unproductive labourer, but the same singer commissioned by an entrepreneur to sing in order to make money for him is a productive labourer, for she produces capital. In the aforesaid book, A History of Sociology in Britain, A.H. Halsey, partially rafishly, sorry, but partially profoundly, I think, highlights the distinction between the lazy genius and the hard-working dullard. Furthermore, inveterate British bourgeois methodology and ethics cheerleader Stephen Bartlett has a hit podcast called The Diary of a CEO. And Karl Marx, were he's alive today, would probably listen to this podcast. Yes, both because in so many senses he was a self-described bourgeois intellectual, and because he was also forever busy with attempting to instigate a rather violent revolution against the bourgeoisie's drudgery for others at all costs, state of affairs ensuring dominant role in society. Yes, he would probably be a subscriber to that podcast. So Mr. Marx and Mr. Bartlett both have insights into the psychology of CEOs on the one hand, and the general Philistine aspects of bourgeois society, in Mr. Bartlett's case more unwittingly, controversial, due to its needless, dogmatic, mindless prejudice in favour of practically forever chasing what Karl Marx called exchange value, instead of what, of course, should always really count vis-a-vis most human interactions within society, namely use value, on the other hand. But so too does Taylor Swift, or, as an article from The Observer from earlier today, by the also divine Rosalind Langian, entitled Welcome to Dumb Britain, where anti-intellectualism is on the rise, quotes Taylor Swift as saying, "That's my favourite type of writing, where you have to think, wait, what do these words mean?" Bad accent. Now, total thesaurus maniac, hopeless perennial vocabulary preparer, and doubtlessly a Maximo Park fan were he still alive, Marcel Proust once said, "All paradises are lost paradises." However, I think Taylor Swift's business come music empire can take a few amateur polemical hits now and again, without much harm being done. At any rate, the attentive video viewer may have realised that a few minutes earlier in this video, I alluded to a certain rather sinister policy in the residential home for autistic people where I live, called portion control. Da, 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 da. Well, over in sociology land, productivity is defined as the ratio of input to output. Thus, in other words, from the standpoint of someone who doesn't want to expire in a freak heart attack or brain hemorrhage accident, my version, I guess, of those repetitively gruesome freak gardening accidents that were always slaying the drummers from the band Spinal Tap during the film Spinal Tap, well, the amount of solitary confinement style manual spell checking that I've unavoidably had to wade through this afternoon has led me to think that, as my adoptive dad Mark Francis often said when he was indicating that me and my dear sister Alice's time spent watching that particular 1990s zeitgeist vibe inflected evening's television was, well, at an end, it's Ofsky Tchaikovsky time. And so, again, comrades, friends, and of course fellow travellers of various varieties, hopefully speak to some of you soon. And, again, as Bruce Dickinson often used to say, after the end of another aspirationally high-octane, certainly psychologically eventful evening, thank you and good night. Speak soon. Kindest regards, Ben.